appreciate that. And yes, this summit did come out of one of those moments of saying to my team, what if? And they took that what if and turned it into something. So Jill and Megan and Janelle really get all the credit, but I'm delighted that what if actually turned into something. So I'm going to have Sabrina Finley, Meredith Boyd, and Courtney Cruzan join me on the stage. Courtney.
Hi.
Sabrina. I know Meredith is here. Meredith, there you go. Perfect. Well, thank you, ladies. This is certainly more fun in some ways to do in person when we're all standing on the stage, but at the same time, it's nice to see everyone in your own environments and still coming together. You all were brought together in part because you've been career experts at bringing folks together across various boundaries, particularly global boundaries. And you're in very high roles within each of your respective companies. So we're delighted to have all three of you here to share your insights and experiences and the deeply transferable knowledge that you have as leaders navigating this pandemic, but also having brought into the pandemic existing strong business practices that have helped your companies thrive and help teach other companies how to thrive. So just to let everyone in the audience know, please feel free to type into the Q&A box any questions that you have as you think of them. In the second half of the presentation, we're going to get into those questions and draw on those for the conversation and directly answer questions. So as you think of them, get them out of your head so you can refocus on the conversation at hand and just put them in the box. And so we're going to start by having each of our panel members really introduce themselves and who they are, what they do within their companies, and what sparked their interest when we first reached out to them and said, what if you join us for this panel conversation at the Women in Textiles Summit? And some of them knew each other prior and some didn't, but there's a great amount of synergy between each of their experiences. So it's been fun working with three of them and having them get to know one another as well. So Sabrina, do you want to kick us off with a brief introduction?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I'm Sabrina Finley. I'm the CEO of Otavo. We're a footwear development and production company. So we're full service manufacturing, design factories, set up our own production lines. We work with brands to design and develop their collections. And I decided to join this because early on in the pandemic, I think I was having a really hard time with a lot of conversations, and anything that was a conversation with a journalist was often really focused on the negative and so much about how everything was failing and there was no way to succeed. And I got into a lot of heated arguments over it. And Lyndon invited me to join another talk. And I loved that talk was focused on solutions, and it was a much more positive and helpful and resourceful conversation. And so that got me really excited to participate in this conversation.
Yeah, hey everybody, I'm Courtney Cruzan. I work for Burr. If you feel cold and want to say Burr, that's what our name is. We develop cooling yarn technology with natural cooling minerals. And I am the Vice President of Sourcing and Product Development. So I work with our we're globally based in Atlanta, Georgia, but we have operations in Taoyuan, in Taiwan. And so I work with our suppliers globally to source new materials and develop fabrics for brands and multiple applications. And to Sabrina's point, I also wanted to be a part of this panel to share best practices and solutions and look at opportunities for how we can all go forward, and also to just to network and be with all these powerful, amazing women who help to drive our industry forward. So thank you.
Meredith, what about you?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Meredith Boyd, and I work with Unify. So many of you may know us as a synthetic yarn manufacturer. We're about 50 years old, but we transformed from being a commodity US-based supplier of polyester and nylon into the leading global supplier for recycled materials through our Reprieve platform, and also other performance and value-added products now on a global basis, producing throughout the Americas and Asia. I'm responsible for our global innovation and technology. So one of the reasons that this particular panel and this conference sparked my interest is because at the heart of great ideation and innovation is collaboration, and an opportunity to come together with like-minded individuals, many of whom have definitely been pivoting in what they've been working on in the past year, is just a really exciting opportunity. So I love the idea of a conversational day to talk about what we've been doing and what comes next. So thanks for inviting me today.
Well, thank you. So as we jump into the conversation here, I have a few themes that each of the ladies are going to speak to, and then we'll get into more open conversation and Q&A. With that, Sabrina, when we first spoke in the spring, we reached out to you because you have manufacturing all over the world. So trying to figure out how to communicate with folks on the other side of the world in different time zones, using video and manufacturing, all of these things were existing best practices that you had in place. And you also talked a lot about what was happening with the new year and the cycles of how you managed workforce. And so we use that as an opportunity to say to folks, no matter where they're manufacturing or the scale they're manufacturing, here are some tangible ways that you can connect folks and keep business moving forward. And so then with that, there was a lot of conversation that came out too about the optimism and the can-do attitude, which you referred to. We weren't calling on you and saying, what's the devastation look like in China and how is that shutting down your ability to manufacture? We're saying, how do we keep going? And so I'm wondering if you can share more about the practices in your company that you had in place before the pandemic and how that helped foster this sense of we can do it and how can I help when you're reaching out to partnering companies?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons why we were so prepared for the pandemic was because we were always preparing for something else. And I think the pandemic is certainly not the first time we've experienced hardship or, something disrupting our supply chains. And I know that's probably true of a lot of people here. We've had typhoons wipe out our inventory. We've had power grids go down, no notice for when we could open up factories again. And so I think the idea of just having contingency planning is a best practice to have for a lot of businesses, especially in manufacturing. I think one of the challenges is also that manufacturing, I think people outside of our industry often think about it as one factory that you're managing, and everyone knows it's not true. Even if you make a simple product, you have supporting labs, raw material suppliers, toolings experts. And so it's a really complicated network of, factories and vendors. And when something goes wrong with one of those businesses, it disrupts all of us. So it's always been really important for us as part of our contingency planning, number one, just to be really well connected with all of those other businesses and support each other. And so it comes in the form of backup planning, for example. So being able to, replace certain services or materials, and not in a way where you're choosing one relationship over the other, but where you're kind of helping each other out. We're passing along a lot of contacts between other businesses that are also experiencing these type of things. And then the other thing that was really major for us was just, having this attitude of we're all separate physically. And I think that's become more and more the norm, right? Like our primary assembly might be in China, but we'll have, a factory in Minnesota that's supporting us with, raw materials or textiles. We'll work with a factory in France to develop components, and all of these things have to, come together globally. And so our teams are already separate, meaning different time zones, different offices. And so we've already been used to, having virtual meetings, having a lot of, applications that help us communicate across different time zones. And part of that has also become a way to like bring people into factories virtually. And so, factory tours for us, in the past, a lot of them were in person, right? Like we always had, brands and clients travel out to us. We would go visit to other factories, but as you grow, it becomes a harder and harder thing to do with more people. And so a lot of that has shifted to, using FaceTime to do factory tours even. It's also, requiring us to ask more of the companies that we work with. And so if we need to show them a development problem on site at a factory, like we'll ask the designer, like, can you stay up at, 2 a.m. and can we schedule a 2 a.m. meeting with you and have your team, join us on a Zoom call so that we can show you something on site at the factory. So I think, we already had that strong collaboration between us and close partners, and we've kind of pushed on it more during the pandemic and, pushed it out to client businesses as well, and asking more of them and asking more of their employees to participate in a more flexible way. And I think those things just, they're definitely very people focused. Like you're asking more of people. And that's been a really big part of how we've been able to do well.
As you ask more of people, do you see that that's met with people stepping up differently and leaning in differently?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting as far as identifying, I think, what people's strengths are and what they enjoy. We've definitely been pivoting a lot of employee roles, factory side in the office, right? And so, in trying to navigate the pandemic, we had to shift parts of the supply chain. We had to, if one vendor was out for a couple of months, we had to find another resource, another warehouse. The same thing happens with talent. We have people in production planning that might shift over to shipping and logistics. And it's just everyone does what is needed to maintain for the team. And so I think, for sure, we ask more of people as far as flexibility and adaptability, but we also give them a lot more, right? We give them a lot more in terms of just transparency and helping them see the rest of the business. And I think it's something that I think our company was really heavily criticized for a lot of our practices early on because, manufacturing by nature, I think, is very secretive, right? You can't patent every single process or a lot of trade secrets. No one likes to tell, they don't like to share the secret sauce. They don't want to go through every detail of how things are done. But the reality is, if you don't introduce more of that into your relationships internally within your company, and then also, externally with partners and vendors, I mean, how can you expect people to react? Like, how can you expect them to be flexible and adaptable and pick up something new and help solve a problem if they can't see that bigger picture? And so, and again, this was something that was a part of what we did already. And I think a lot of people were critical of it, but it's also shown to be successful for us. And we've also, pushed it more on our factory partners and on our clients. And really in simple terms, it comes in the form of us educating the people around us and the people around us educating us, and just being a lot more transparent about what the problems are, what the solutions are, sharing technology, sharing processes, sharing resources. I mean, at the end of the day, like, none of us really succeed if the industry itself is failing and if our networks are failing. And so kind of taking that risk of being more transparent has been, meaningful to our success. And I think it's also, meaningful to the success of the individual in the midst of all of this.
Courtney, when we first spoke, jumping off of what Sabrina is saying, some of the themes that jumped out to you were this transparency and the resilience and how companies are pivoting and reworking what they're doing. You come at this from a very different point in the supply chain, in that instead of dealing with finished products, you're on the other end of it. Can you speak more to your experience with this theme of resilience and how companies have responded to and changed their product lines or ways of working with one another and communicating as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, so to Sabrina's point, I like her. She's talking a lot about contingency planning, and that's what I think all of us have been doing throughout the pandemic, is constantly redoing forecasts and redoing them again. And we found that with our supplier, with our brand partners, I should say, because we manufacture both the yarn and work with various mills on the fabric production, that there's a lot of contracting happening in product lines. So everybody's looking to see, okay, what are my core strengths and what am I selling well, and kind of trim off the extra fat of additional product and refocusing that. So that's what we did a lot of as well internally. And the biggest challenges that we were getting, that we had to really be transparent with our partners, is in pricing. So there's been like an increase in polymer pricing. We know globally there's a shortage. We had, for instance, somebody come who we all know, but won't say who they are, that took up almost all the spandex available in the market and drove up our spandex prices, like 180% increases on spandex. So that's been a challenge. But when we go to our partners and say, hey, this is the challenges that we're facing, and we need you, this is why our pricing needs to increase, then they're able to pivot around their price points as well. And it's all about the relationships that we've had established, and that we are more of we're a specific type of technology that people are coming to us for, that added performance. So what is good about the situation that we're in is that with this contracting, then brands are focusing more on the performance level that they want to see. They want to deliver on what the consumers are asking for. So we're seeing a lot more discussions on biodegradability and and added functionality, and having and focusing in on those technologies, because we're not just constantly throwing stuff out just to get something out in the market. We're having time to really analyze more on how to get a best practice and how to get a best product that's out there. And so those are the challenges, but also kind of those opportunities that have come out. And as far as, for me, I haven't seen a big change as far as communication, except for on trade shows. So I think the Apparel Textile Sourcing Network, they've done a really great job in connecting vendors when we haven't been able to be at in-person shows. And for instance, they've been holding a couple different events, and they'll have breakout sessions where you can go and speak to a sourcing representative who will say, okay, I know I need to find specifically a double knit in 300 GSM in whatever range of price point that is. And they were able to connect me with 5 new mill partners in China and do a session of Zoom calls back to back directly with those mill partners. So I'm online all the time. I think most of us are 24/7, but it's really finding new ways to get to people, which I've found has actually been a little bit. I've been able to kind of hone in more on my sourcing direction, because I need to know very specific, and I'm not walking through halls and halls of like a Shanghai Intertextile where I've got 3,000 potential people I can talk to. I can use data analysis, and I can hone in on, I only need to talk to 30 of these people, and it's a lot easier on my feet, but I need some Sabrina shoes to help me out. But yeah, so I think, you know, the digital, we'd be lost without the digital connection. But again, just using different platforms and making it work for us. So, yeah, and looks like we lost Meredith, but just coming back.
Hopefully she'll pop back here in a minute. Are there innovations or materials that you think have come out of this that are going to stick around, or areas that you anticipate we should be watching for in innovation?
Well, definitely biodegradable fibers. There's a lot more happening in circularity and biodegrade. There's the company that is US-based, Ciclo, who is doing some developments on biodegradable polyester. There's also some new developments as well in nylon. I was just speaking with a supplier who's using nylon sources because there's a glut in the market on certain post-industrial or pre-consumer and post-industrial polymers that are available for nylons. And so they're using car tires and breaking down the nylon from car tires and using that as a post-consumer and industrial waste for nylon fibers. Yeah, so constantly doing. I've been in Taiwan for 5 years and China for 2 years, so I've been working a lot in all different kinds of circularity and food waste and making that into fibers, and but what can be commercially adopted and market and be able to scale up quickly. That's where I think everybody's honing more into, and I know Unify can speak to that because they do convert everything from bottle waste. But we do have a lot of people asking us also for ocean waste plastic and cleaning. So that would be cleaning the ocean. Now you're still recreating a new product, right? So it's not completely going away, but you're cleaning as well as developing new product.
Yeah, I will say we're seeing a lot of we've been seeing a lot of change in terms of inquiries and what people are interested in pursuing, and I think it's a normal thing whenever the world is going through some sort of disruption or hardship. A lot of ideas often come out of that, and again, like with biodegradable materials, we're seeing, that in terms of like outsole components, additives for materials, inquiries have we've seen more of a shift from sort of fast fashion to things that are more sustainable, more ethical, and, definitely more innovative, interesting materials. So yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of that as well.
Yep. And there was a lot of conversation too around whether sustainability would still be a big focus for brands going forward. And they have a lot of back and forth conversations. And what we're finding is that it's the request for recyclability and biodegradability has been higher coming out of this, and I think going forward. So then we can transition over to Meredith to share more with that.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I was just trying to add real world drama to dropping off in the middle of the meeting. So that's our internet here.
Well, we're glad that you're back on, and it's a good time to transition over to you. Recycling is a topic, and sustainability within materials has come up in this conversation. I know when we first talked, that was something that we really got into quite a bit in the conversation, as well as how the supply chain has changed in terms of global versus regional access to materials and the connectivity between companies there. Would you or to the recycling piece as well?
I'd be happy to touch on both, Lyndon. Just as Courtney was just saying, I think that there was some wondering in the market around sustainable goods and would COVID change any of that? But we've absolutely seen a double down, an emphasis as brands and retailers and consumers. They're making decisions. They're making really thoughtful decisions about where they spend their money and what types of companies that they're buying product from and what is the impact. So the opportunity to have sustainability take an even higher position from a value standpoint is also letting those brands and retailers differentiate their product in a time, to the point earlier, when they're actually seeing some contraction in maybe what product lines have looked like historically. So we have absolutely seen sustainability, recycled raw materials, and ability to design for sustainability or circularity as being very active conversations during the pandemic that have only become more rapid during this period. So we're very encouraged by that. We're excited. And I think that it kind of does play nicely into the second part of your comment, Lyndon, about supply and global versus regional. You know, decades ago, the American US manufacturer was very much focused on the US market, the North American market, and everything did change. Then it became an industry that is globalized. And one element of that is producing products where customers need them. And that is also a sustainability element in itself, ensuring that goods aren't traveling further than what they need to for the next step of a process or even the final consumer. So one thing we've seen in the past year, particularly going back a year ago, was that suddenly there was a high amount of regional demand. So that would be region for region, for materials particularly related to PPE. And so suddenly industries that had left or didn't have the same presence in a particular area were suddenly put under tremendous demand. Or we saw a lot of innovation occurring as well, where different companies that historically had not worked in certain sectors were finding ways to produce products that were in very high demand. And that it was a little bit of a quick reverse on what we had seen years ago with certain industries gravitating to perhaps production in Asia only. We saw a lot of emphasis come back on the security that regionalized manufacturing brings, whether we're in the US or Central America, or if we're in Europe or Asia. So I do think that in whether you look at it as a sustainable principle or a principle in innovation, we saw a pivot that occurred. And the fact that now you've seen companies who challenge themselves to do things differently or develop a product or a process in a very short period of time, I say take what you've learned and do more of it. There is a real opportunity to look at what we've all been through in the past year, having to change ways that we've done some things or reinforce ways we've done another. And we can do more of that to see further opportunity within our industry. We've had developments that were executed in easily a quarter of the time of our historic development lead time, because there was such an emphasis and such an investment of resources, not only at our company, but by the other players in the value chain as well, by suppliers who were working with us, by our customers, and even our customer's customer. So I liked the mentioning earlier about transparency. That is so critical. I know people always say, you know, communication is the key, but it is. I mean, without that, I think the last year would have been a lot more challenging than it was. But instead, we leveraged those opportunities to think outside the box, do things differently, innovate into products, processes, applications that many of us had not touched before. And again, you know, I would just encourage, do more of that. Get out of that's how we've always done it. We've all probably heard that at our companies before, particularly companies that are longer term established. But this taught us we can pivot and we can do things in a progressive way. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of that as we go forward too, through the whole value chain.
Yeah, I think what Meredith is saying about thinking about what innovation looks like in terms of opportunity. I think there are a lot of opportunities that aren't obvious, but they're there and they're really hard to identify without having that more transparent conversation. And I think also thinking more globally instead of regionally. I mean, even if the goal is to be more regional, I think there's participating in that global conversation is really important. For us, we kind of looked at a few things that, were frankly just failures for us, and reevaluated what those failures were. And we were able to find, not opportunities in all of them, but definitely some interesting opportunities in some of those failures. One example would be we were previously competing with a factory in Germany and, supplying same clients. They started having issues with their supply chain. We also, weren't as competitive as they were in certain areas. And so we kind of regrouped, had a conversation with them, and invited them into, our supply chain to see how we did things, better understood what their technology was. And we now have a very different relationship in that we're no longer competitors. We are now supplying a company that was formerly a competitor, and not with the finished part, or the finished product, but we're supplying, part of the technology, part of the component, part of the work. And so it, what seemed like a business that was just going to end and not go well ended up, shifting into a whole different area. And now it's good for us. It's good for them. It's not what we set out to do, but it's working better and it's now become something more sustainable and long-term. And so I think there's this idea of, again, going back to transparency, this idea of just being honest about what our weaknesses are in the supply chain, but also really focusing on what we do well and how we overlap with other companies and how we might work with them differently. And, it's not going to work out 100% of the time, but I think a lot of the really interesting opportunities come out of those conversations.
There's definitely something with all that where the pandemic has brought clarity and granted a lot of permission in terms of saying there's this thing that is bigger than all of us and outside of our control. And so previously, where companies might have held things close to chest because there's perceptions of what can or can't they control, suddenly there's this great enabling factor of being able to say, this is fully outside of our control. How can we come together regardless of it and because of it and have conversations that were never previously possible? It's really, I think, quite exciting and a radically different way of thinking about working together. What other points do you all want to bring up in the conversation before we get into some of the questions that are popping up on the side?
I was curious to know, have there been any new specific business practices that either Sabrina or Meredith have put into implementation because of ways of pivoting?
Yeah, I think there's too many to list.
Yeah, maybe the best one that's worked for you.
I think in terms of physical work has changed for us, right? So I would say quality is a big area, quality control, quality assurance is a big area that we're evolving. And, it's a lot of the same processes done differently, but it's also sort of introducing new ways of reporting and sharing information because, even when, obviously we can't travel internationally easily right now, but even, throughout the pandemic, there have been times where things have been shut down locally, right, between, labs and factories and things like that, or, restrictions on, people traveling into certain areas or buildings. And so I think, again, a lot of the digital documentation that we've had to shift to for QC has been really important, but a lot of it is also, it comes down to people and how they communicate. And so, having real-time communications on problems that are happening at factories, fundamentally require people to work in a different way and have more unique schedules, right? And so we do a lot more nighttime work, but then for us, that also has been translating into a lot of different practices or, implementing new policies in HR because we also want to maintain fairness, work-life balance, and make sure this is actually a sustainable way for people to work. And so It's also started changing, what paid time off looks like. It's changing. I mean, when we go, we're currently all work from home right now, at least our team in the US. But, what is going back to the office going to look like? Because we now know we don't actually have to be there 9 to 5. And so we're not planning to go back to what was normal. We're planning to figure out a better version of it that makes more sense for people and makes more sense for the business. So, so I think a lot of the things that we've been changing in terms of practices have been really practical, technical things, factory side, lab side, but also just a lot of HR culture policies and changing how we work together has been a really big deal for us too.
Yeah, and I would just second that at the heart of our biggest changes, Courtney, I would say it comes down to communication. We thought we were good communicators before, and I don't just mean with suppliers and customers. I mean with our own colleagues, our employees, our shareholders. We thought we were just doing a great job, but I think this gave us an opportunity to go a lot deeper with the communications that we were having. First of all, COVID presented a very unique kind of a juxtaposition between work and health, and ensuring that our employees, first and foremost, were healthy, that they were safe, that their families were safe. And we kept our machines running. And so we did have that need to be here in person and present. But it opened up another level of dialogue to first and foremost look at our greatest resource, which is people, and caring about them as people first. And then ensuring that we could have the business continue to be very strong. But all of that communication that opened up with customers, being candid about needs, that is something that I have seen us introduce at a deeper level that we will continue. That will be a business practice that definitely changes. And the other piece I would say is because we didn't have people traveling to the same degree, we had a lot of resources that had not been present at our plants back here in North Carolina. And we took the opportunity to ensure our foundation is very strong. And I second what you said, Sabrina. Quality is one of those areas where there is extra eyes, and thoughtful documentation and analytics can really go a long way when it comes to ensuring that we are producing what our customers expect at the best efficiencies we can. So that foundation is an area that we have really tried to have some depth conversations of depth, and that also has included making key technology investments during this time, knowing that we're going to have an industry raring to go that's already getting quite active coming out of this pandemic.
I think both of those points are really great, and it was interesting when we all met. I was experiencing one of those great shifts of the pandemic in terms of previously, if I had a sick kiddo, it's like the workday's over. You got to head home and deal with it. And instead, we had this great conversation that went on for an hour, and I was rocking a little baby with a fever. And then we were getting our COVID test in the afternoon, and just you keep going. And there's this ability to be in more spaces at the same time. And honor all those spaces simultaneously. That's, I think, really exciting that's come out of this. In terms of some of the questions that we have popping up, and the point about quality control, there's a question here: as suppliers trim and pivot their production, do you find testing is more important than before to ensure all product specs are being met?
Yeah, I would say yes, especially if you have contingency planning and backup suppliers as part of the process. So, because the pandemic has put us in a position where sometimes we have to shift production from one facility to the next, or replace one supplier with another because of raw materials not available. I mean, all of this means that it's basically, in a way, a less secure supply chain because you're introducing more complexity into it and trying to keep up with timelines and deliveries. And so, again, we're doing a lot of the same. We're just doing more of it and spreading it out more. And so, if you're buying adhesives two bond materials and the adhesives are now coming from two different facilities. Like, how do you, quality control ensure that they're, on par with each other and performing the same way? So, the end result looks like finished production where everything still kind of looks the same, but to get it done in that same competitive timeline at that same competitive quality has become a lot harder. And quality control practices for sure is a really major part of that.
Yeah, and I, even being a little upstream in the value chain, Sabrina, I completely agree. I mean, our goal is for our customer to have a seamless transition if there are transitions happening behind the scenes. And I think every point in the value chain has been impacted by changing suppliers or a greater number of suppliers that they might be evaluating with that contingency planning at play. But testing has always been important. I think most of us would put it as our highest facet in terms of delivering a first quality, high quality product. But it has become more important just when there are more items in the population that you're considering with every change that occurs. And I think we've all, I can speak for my company, but I think a lot of us have dealt with an increase in demand for highly customized products. Gone are the days of what we might term tunning and gunning it, where you're running 1, 2, 3 products the whole year, day in, day out. Brands and retailers are demanding products that meet their specific needs. And in many cases, that can mean that you're doing more customized work, which also introduces another level of need when it comes to testing the product that's going out. So that's been not a COVID related change necessarily, but definitely something we've only seen increase in the past few years.
What about, with a question here, would you recommend biodegradable over recyclable, and why?
Yeah, I can speak to that. There's two different questions on recyclable materials, and I was just speaking with a European agent yesterday about the biodegradable versus recyclable. Definitely recyclable is more available now than it is, plus the costing is much more effective than biodegradable at the moment. Also think about this land space that you have, right? If you because Europe, they're not as interested in the biodegradable because they don't have the amount of space to properly biodegrade that material back into the land versus recyclable. You can keep the reuse of that. So I would kind of link them together in a circularity and look and see what is a circularity product, and then what can be mass produced better with recyclable. So I would say recycling is going to be the better. And then the question about how do brands increase the use of recyclable materials, how can suppliers help make sure that they're being properly recycled? Then you want to make sure your suppliers are giving you a GRS certification, which is the global recycling standard. And that is a certificate that is a third party certified to say that you are meeting all the requirements, and of course to make sure that they're Okotex, and if applies also Blue Sign certified from production standpoint. Yeah, but did you want to talk to that, Sabrina?
Yeah, I mean, I think implementing any of it wherever you can is a good thing. I think as far as choosing one or the other, it's really hard to just say pick this or that, because it's often also dependent on like what you're trying to achieve with the material or product. And you can't recycle all things. Not all things are biodegradable. So it's kind of figuring out where you can choose to use those things. And we'll say one of the areas that we try to talk about with brands is actually more recycling in the production process. And so I think a lot of brands come to us with the idea of like designing where the product itself is biodegradable or recyclable. And so much of the waste that happens is in the process and not in the product itself. And so there's a lot of opportunities there. You might not have metal in your products, but you probably use some metal in toolings or production processes. Those are things that can be recycled. It's also a way to actually, offset costs and like build factory relationships with smaller, more specialized vendors. So For example, we work with one tooling maker where they take on the work and the responsibility of a lot of the recycling of metals, but they take the money from that recycling, and the brands basically let them do that. But it's beneficial to the brand because there's a more friendly, eco-friendly process in place. It's seamless. It's not a lot of work for the brand to have to deal with it. There's a benefit to the vendor for doing the extra work. So I think, involving brands more in the supply chain and helping them understand where waste happens in the process and not just with the product is a good way to introduce more of that, and to have that open conversation with brands to see where they're willing to invest in either more time, more money to make some of those things possible for factories.
Sabrina, I completely agree on the whole value chain, having healthy accountability as we look at how to address the waste issue that the entire industry creates, including the consumer. And different applications in different industries have different challenges. So apparel, for example, you can have very high percentages of waste at the cut and sew stage, whereas perhaps contract fabric, it's going to be lower, or automotive, it can be a bit lower. So looking at opportunities to personalize, how are we going to address the waste that's being generated is a great opportunity. There is an increasing amount of recycled synthetics that are continuing to be used every year, and the infrastructure to produce those is still growing because the vast majority of synthetics that are produced are still from virgin feedstock. So I also agree with you, Courtney, making sure that where you might be choosing to use a recycled material and have that greater value proposition and lesser environmental impact, do be sure that it comes with the credibility that it needs. And that's, Courtney gave great examples of third-party groups that can help you have that assertion. I think that circularity, which I think this question is alluding towards, and Sabrina, you touched on, it's coming, but that infrastructure also has to be developed, not just the recycling technologies to be further developed to handle more contaminated materials, but also the infrastructure for collection and sortation. I think it's interesting, Courtney mentions Europe. Many of us may be watching that extended producer responsibility legislation and the dialogue around where will there be accountability on producers for what happens to waste at the end. So I think there are some important data points to also be watching as that infrastructure is developed and the systems themselves come to more of a mass scale instead of being more on a niche basis. But I do think circularity will continue to evolve, but there is a lot of opportunity in the value chain today to address waste there.
I'm curious from the three of you as well in terms of trends that you're seeing driven by consumers, particularly even as Lucy was talking about, and with the work in your own companies, trends towards knitwear with folks that are having garments that are more appropriate for being on Zoom. You have your leggings on and whatever's on the top. And so the ability to manufacture knit versus sewing a full garment. And then also what consumers are looking for in terms of those third-party certifications and information about the fibers going into things. So what are you guys predicting or suspecting is going to happen next within these trends that are really driven by that end buyer?
Well, Lyndon, I'm curious for Courtney and Sabrina's thoughts on a specific area of this, which is e-commerce, because we have all seen a lot of e-commerce trucks and other trucks delivering e-commerce goods during this period. And I think it's going to have a change on the way that we communicate and talk about all of our items, because in some cases, they may not interact with our textile products like they once did. So I'm curious, Courtney and Sabrina, if you all could share something maybe you've changed about your products because of the rise of e-commerce.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this has sort of been evolving a lot already pre-pandemic. I mean, and we're largely in footwear. We do some apparel, but footwear is such a challenging product in that you can't really know if it fits well unless you try it on. And a lot of what we've been building into the development process. And in the past, it was sort of like us pushing it on brands, and it's actually, in some cases, we now just make it a requirement. The actual development processes for products has changed, in that it's become more and more important to build consistency and reliability in terms of like sizing and fit, how certain things feel. Photography obviously is super important. And I think in the past there was a lot of focus on, making something look better than it was, but people also appreciate things looking exactly like what they actually look like with e-commerce. So I think, really the big thing for us has been sort of in product development, where in the past we would, get a lot of requests from brands where they would want to, cut costs, which, is a thing that a lot of everyone's trying to do someplace. But it would translate into sort of a less reliable development process where you're sharing toolings across products where the toolings are sort of not ideal and don't create consistency. It's things like, and this ties into QC, which we were talking about earlier. Having more expensive, more tedious QC processes allow us to more consistently develop materials across different styles that have sort of the same tightness or fit or weight that impacts how people react to a product. And so really the end goal is for people to have for the end consumer to have a clear understanding of what they're going to get before they ever receive it. And that comes with brand consistency and product consistency and material consistency. And all those things really happen in the product development process, whether it's developing the textile or developing the finished product. And so really the big thing that we've done, where we were more flexible in the past on some of these things, we're like, okay, if you don't want to spend money on this quality control process, or you don't want to spend money on this additional lab testing or these additional toolings, we would go that route. And it was more manageable because brands could better deal with returns when they were in more brick and mortar, when they weren't outside of the pandemic. But right now, I mean, we will flat out just tell a company, if you don't do this, it'll be a cheaper development process. You'll spend less money upfront, but you're going to see a higher rate of returns. And I mean, there's data out there now that helps you understand how much more you'll see in returns for certain product categories if you don't make that initial investment of creating quality toolings, quality textiles, and testing for consistency, and just having a really strong, reliable product development process. And we don't want to deal with the backlash of when brands experience those returns. And so for certain areas of development, it's now just a requirement for us, where we won't pursue a certain type of development. We won't accept cutting corners in certain areas, because we know even if it's cheaper up front, the end result is not actually going to be better for the consumer. It's not actually going to be better for the brand.
Yeah, no, I'll just second all the points that Sabrina made. It's like, it's really looking kind of reverse engineering the product from what is the price point, and then engineering it down to the product development, and then, like you said, getting it right. Because we know that when you're shopping online, a lot of times you're going to buy 2 or 3 of something, and you're going to return the 2 when you're not going to want. So it's the level of like accountability, but also the amount of level of service that the brands have to also add, and just completely change their whole distribution model of how they even handle all of those influx of returns. And that's a huge cost on your operations. So so just developing the best from the beginning.
Yeah, one thing we found was that there was a craving to have more analytical data and more detailed technical discussion of what makes a product different, whether it was a performance and functionality product or a sustainable offering like a recycled product. And I think as the brands are looking to have products that are perhaps placed on e-commerce, it's giving them something more to talk about and for the consumer to read about, to differentiate. And Lyndon, to your comment on third-party certifications, that is one of the ways that it adds that additional depth of understanding for the consumer, so that they're learning, what does it mean when I choose to buy recycled, or what does it mean when I choose, a product that's produced under social sustainable conditions. So I think anything that adds that depth, and in often in words or in numbers, is being seen as appealing in this new era.
I think what Meredith is saying about people wanting more data about specific products is really, really important. And I think it should be a big focus for all manufacturing. And it's become more true during the pandemic, because when we see problems in production where, if we have like a defect in a product, that defect often isn't, across the entire production. It might be in, 10 items out of 10,000. And in the past, it was really easy to sort of identify and manage those things. If, everyone's in the factory, seeing where it happens, and it's just easier to explore. But shifting to, people having to be separate in a way and working remotely, it's made all of that harder. And so I think putting in place practices and systems that help us track not just finished products, but components and parts of the process, like understanding, what batch of yarns, what production line worked on what versions of the product, and building that more into our manufacturing systems makes it much faster to identify where the problems happen. Like, we had one issue where, we had a minor defect in a really small batch of product. It was like a couple of cartons. And, but it was a product that was made across multiple primary assembly factories. The raw materials came from different places. And it was really hard. It took us, I think, over 2 weeks to figure out where those specific cartons of products came from. And we had to identify which factory workers worked on a certain process that went into the product for those 2 cartons. And to have a team of people spend 2.5 weeks to figure out that, it was 2 factory workers who needed a little more training. It was really expensive and time consuming. It was also nerve wracking, because we're like, is it only in these 2 cartons, or is it, across a larger part of the production? I think there are a lot of things like that have become a lot harder to deal with during the pandemic. And so much of what we're doing in QC right now is being more preventative, and a huge part of being preventative is not just in the actual inspections and lab tests, but it's in the tracking of everything. And so I think batch tracking and understanding how all the things come together has become a really big focus for us as well.
Well, thank you all. We are up on time here. I think we could continue the conversation for hours. So hopefully everyone got their Starbucks coffee before the afternoon kicked off. There's a bunch more questions on the side. Anyone who asks questions where you still want more information, feel free to reach out to the ladies throughout the rest of the event, chat with them at the various tables, or reach out to them as speakers. Megan can help connect folks as needed. So thank you all so much for your time, and it was great chatting.
Thanks, Lyndon. It's good seeing you.